Everyone. My name is Emily Greenwood, and I'm a first year PhD researcher. And I'm looking into this topic of feeling versus showing emotion. What I mean by that, and I'll come on to this a bit later, is what happens when what we're feeling physiologically, what we're feeling in our body, and what we're communicating by our behavior, by our face and our voice and our gestures, what happens when that matches and what happens when that doesn't match. And the premise of my research is when co-regulation, which happens within the infant and parent relationship, goes wrong, there's a disconnect between what we're feeling and what we're showing emotionally. And I put this this subtitle, Why is Society Emotionally Sick and What Can We Do About It? Because what I believe we call mental health illnesses, a lot of mental health illnesses, comes from this lack of an ability to regulate our emotions as we grow up and go through life and into adulthood. So that's really what I'm interested in my research. So I'm going to talk to you today about 4 different things. So firstly, what is showing versus feeling emotion and why does it matter? Part 2 is going to be, how do we know when infants are in distress? Part 3, what can caregivers do and what do caregivers do to decrease infant distress? And part 4, how do children change their behaviour in relation to caregiver responsiveness? Little typo there. It. And also, how does caregiver responsiveness change in relation to their child's temperaments? Because caregivers aren't doing this on their own, they're doing it in response to the infant that they have. So first of all, what is showing versus emotion, and what is showing versus feeling emotion, and why does it matter? So I came at this research firstly from an attachment perspective. And my understanding of attachments has changed somewhat since I first learned about it, but I'll say more about that in a bit. But what is important about attachment is attachment is the first relationship that happens between an infant and their primary caregiver in that kind of initial bonded relationship. And it's the most important relationship you will ever have in your life, because it sets the foundations for every other relationship that you have in your life. So we're used to thinking about attachment in terms of parents and infants. So when you become a parent again in the future, if you become a parent again in the future, your attachment style is already set from when you're a baby. Also, we kind of hear it used more nowadays to do with romantic relationships, but it also applies to every other relationship that you have in your life. So friendships, work relationships, and also the relationship that you have with yourself, and how much trust you have in all of these different relationships. So it really is kind of fundamental to life success, really. So there are 4 kind of main ways that you can attach to your primary caregiver. Although in the attachment literature there are 4 ways, this is kind of a continuous data. The way that the patterns of behaviour are continuous, and they've been grouped by Bowlby and by Ainsworth into 4 main things. But actually what is happening is kind of much more wider than this. And even within the kind of Ainsworth subscales, there are lots of kind of subscales of avoidant, resistant, secure attachment. So it's not kind of as clear cut as it might first appear. But there are basically 2 main ways that you can attach, either securely or insecurely. So if you're secure, that means that everything is going right. As an infant, it means that you need your parents or your caregiver, you communicate that need and your need is met. And that results in you building up a kind of internal perception, internal working model, it's sometimes called, that you can be certain of maternal availability. You know that when you need somebody, somebody is going to respond to you. So those people are fine. The other way that you can attach is insecure, and that can be divided by avoidant and resistant or anxious attachments. So insecure just means obviously not secure. Avoidant are those infants who whose caregivers maybe don't come when their infants need them. So the avoidants are making kind of a bid for their parent to come, and their parent isn't coming. And this means that the avoidant learns to rely on themselves. They don't really have trust for kind of anybody else, and their internal working model of their caregiver, what their internal perception is that a caregiver is consistently rejecting. The other insecure way that you can attach is anxiously attached. So this is where your caregiver is sometimes there and sometimes not. So the anxious infants learn that if they make a big kind of fuss about wanting maternal or caregiver input, something will happen. So they are the ones who are uncertain about maternal availability. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. If they make a fuss, then it tends to come. And then also this latter category was added later. Disorganized attachment is where it happens in homes with trauma, but just where the caregiver is frightening. So maybe not what we think about as big T trauma, but small t trauma. And that's where the person that the infant needs to be their main comfort or their main regulator is also the one that is frightening them. So they don't really know what to do and how to deal with this. And it's kind of a mixture of both avoidant and anxious or resistant. And it's called disorganized because the other two, both avoidant insecure and resistant insecure, have an organized strategy. The avoidance, they avoid their caregiver. The anxious, they make a lot of big fuss. The disorganized, they don't really have a strategy. They don't have an organized way of dealing with this, so they do a bit of both. So the way that we know about attachment and what attachment is primarily and most reliably measured through the strange situation paradigm. So this is a paradigm that's run by an experimenter, and it involves a brief separation or a couple of brief separations between the infant and their caregiver while the infant remains in a room with a stranger, and then the infant and caregiver are reunited. And what we look at, or what is looked at, is the behavior of the infant on reuniting with their caregiver. So what you can see when you do this is really clear differences in the way that the infant's behavior is when they interact with their caregiver. So secure infants here, they tend to use their caregiver as what is called a secure base. So when they're reunited, they kind of go to their mum, they have a cuddle, and then they're fine. They can go back and they can get on playing with the toys. The avoidance, when they're reunited, they tend to avoid their mum. They might just go to the toys and play cursorily with the toys, and they kind of look like they're okay. They don't really need anything. They don't need anybody to help them or calm them down. They're anxious when they are reunited with their caregiver, make a lot of fuss. So they kind of cry a lot. Sometimes they cry a lot, but they don't approach their caregiver. They wait for their caregiver to come to them, and they don't really calm down very easily. And the disorganized might do a mixture of both of these. They might freeze, they might cry, they might stand there still, they might look like a deer in headlights. They don't really know what to do. Okay, so that's what's happening behaviorally. That's what we can see by looking. What is really interesting is what is happening physiologically. So what is happening with the infants' bodies during this kind of situation. So all of the infants have a spike in their heart rate. Their heart rate increases a lot. They get quite stressed or distressed by the separation from their mum or their caregiver. When the caregiver comes back in, the secure ones, they have a cuddle with their caregiver, and then their heart rate returns to normal, to what it was before, quite quickly, within a minute or so. With the anxious, what happens within the body, what happens physiologically, is what you might expect. So they're the ones that make a big fuss and they're not easily calmed down. So they have the big spike when their mum leaves, and then they don't really, even after their mum comes back, they don't really calm down very quickly. It takes them much longer for their heart rate to go back to what it was prior to the separation. What's really interesting is when you look at the avoidant infants. So the avoidant infants, they look a lot less kind of upset by their mum leaving. They don't really look like they need their mum when their mum comes back. They might, go straight to the toys and continue playing with the toys. Their heart rate looks very similar to the anxious infants. So they have a big spike, when their mum leaves, and then it takes them quite a long time for their heart rate to come down after their mum comes back. So what you get here is both the avoidance and the anxious infants are showing a similar pattern physiologically, so a similar pattern with what their heart rate is doing and the distress that they're feeling. But their behavior is very different, almost the opposite, in fact. So what I'm really interested in is why does this happen? And what does this mean for this development of showing versus feeling emotion throughout life? And what does it mean in terms of emotion regulation? What is going on for all of these kids? And for all of us, you know, when we are feeling these big emotions, and how do we become the kind of kids where, or the adults where our emotions and the big feelings can go back to normal quite quickly, rather than us feeling dysregulated and it taking quite a long time for us to go back to normal. Now, the reason that I think this is important is because if you look at the breakdown of attachment distribution, so like how much of the population has each of the different attachment styles. I mean, and this isn't an exact science. First of all, attachment is an exact science. There's problems with the strange situation. There's problems with how it's measured. It's cross-culturally, does it really work? We're not really so sure, but it is a really useful tool in kind of thinking about this kind of stuff. But in attachment research, roughly 50 to 70% of the population are fine. You know, they've built up this reliable model of somebody who's always there to meet their needs. The other 50 to 30% of people are not fine. They have these insecure, disorganized attachment styles. They have kind of different opinions about the trust of others and the trust of themselves. So that's a lot of the population. And these children grow up into adults that have these same kind of beliefs about themselves and about others. And that's why I think it's an interesting issue to look into. I mentioned briefly emotion regulation in terms of attachment. So emotion regulation is just simply like how emotion is regulated within the body. So we think about regulation, and that's about keeping something within a normal range, so not too high or not too low, somewhere in the middle. It's keeping it regular. You can see from the quotes on this slide that emotion was first talked about as in behavioral terms. So how do we keep control of our behavior when we're feeling upset? And kind of later it goes on to being talked about in more of a physiological, so a bodily sense as well. So as well as keeping control of our behavior, can we also control what is happening to us internally, and how high our heart rate is, and what can we do to bring this down? And we hear a lot these days about being mindful and meditation and yoga and breathing and connecting with our body and all those kind of things to bring emotion, to bring our emotion back down to within a kind of normal range. So we learn emotion regulation first off from our early caregivers. When a newborn baby is born, it can regulate a little bit to some extent, like it can close its eyes if it's getting overly stimulated, but the rest of it we have to learn from our caregiver, and that is what is called co-regulation. We are basically reliant on our caregiver to regulate us, to regulate our distress and also our happy states as well. So it happens within the caregiver infant dyad. So a dyad just means two people. It's physiological, so it happens in the body, and it's about this optimal zone that I talked about. So keeping arousal, yes, it fluctuates up and down, but keeping it generally not too high and not too low. And it also includes this idea of rupture and repair. So of course, babies, kids, teenagers, adults are all going to go too high and too low with their emotions sometimes, and that's okay as long as there's a repair of that and they can come back to within this arousal zone. So there's different patterns of co-regulation that happen with caregivers and infants. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the terms of all of these, but in the first graph here, you can see this is co-regulation, just a graph of co-regulation happening. So this on the y-axis is the emotional intensity, so how intense is the feeling, and here is just over time. And partner one is the dotted line, so partner one is the person having the emotion, and partner two is their partner. So you can see here in this first one where this is co-regulation going well, is partner one is having an intense emotional experience, and partner two responds by also having an emotional kind of heightening of intensity, although not as high. And then by that happening, so by partner two coming up to meet partner one, both partners are able to come back down to within this optimal arousal zone. So partner two is having an effect, it's regulating partner one. Here too at the end is something that they've called stress buffering, but this basically happens where so again, the dotted line is person one is having an intense emotional experience, and person two isn't reacting at all. So this wouldn't really be somebody in a close relationship with person one, it would be a stranger. It might be, you know, this sometimes happens with depressed people, they don't have these intense extremes of emotions, but just by virtue of there being somebody there who is not having an emotional reaction, person one is able to calm down quicker than if they had been there alone. What can also happen is this, and we see this quite often in, I don't know, arguments or crisis situations, is person one goes up, person two goes up, person one goes up, person two, and they kind of feed off each other and make this kind of positive feedback loop where they're both getting more and more intense in their emotion and more distressed. And that's kind of the opposite of what you want to happen, really. So the next question is, how do we know when infants are in distress? So on the surface, this is kind of obvious, right? Infants that cry, they can't do anything else. They cry when they're in distress, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. There are two ways that we can define infant distress. So the first actually is physiological, as we've talked about. So what is happening in their body? If we measure their heart rate, we can see really the body doesn't lie. We can see really clearly what's happening with their heart rate around certain instances, and also we can see what's happening with their behavior. So really we're looking at what's happening with their vocal behavior and a facial effect, and that's what I'm going to be looking at in my research. There are other things as well, you know, like how active they are, their gestures, and things like that. But that's kind of outside of the remit of what I'm going to be looking at. So how do we define infant distress physiologically? What we are thinking of doing is taking their heart rate and looking at that with some movement and making this composite measure. And then what we can do is, if we have, for instance, infant arousal level over the day. So arousal just means kind of how big their emotion is, how intense their emotion is physiologically, is you can just look at the top 95th percentile. So what happens 5% of the time at the top, and look at what happens around these times. So we can say if the infant's heart rate is 95% higher than it usually is, then obviously something is going on to make the infant kind of distressed. Or really happy. They also get this spike when they're happy as well. And then we can take this, what happens in these instances, and look at what's going on around them. Now, this question that I'm really interested in is, can we use behaviour to define infant distress? So we talked before about in attachment and in the strange situation, how sometimes what is happening in the body and physiologically doesn't match what is happening behaviorally, and that's a problem. And it's also a problem in how you look at this, because how can you marry up what's going on outside and inside the body? So in early life, there is going to be more of an alignment between what is going on in the body and behaviorally, because infants haven't learnt any other ways to communicate. They come out of the womb, they cry, they close their eyes, they just do all that reflexively. over the first year of life, as infants transition towards more flexible and intentional forms of communication, they learn to verbalize, they learn to speak, they learn to use their facial gestures, they learn to smile. Does that hold true? Are we seeing a reflection on the outside of infants in their behavior, what they're experiencing physiologically? So one way that we can look at this is just to have lots and lots of data of lots and lots of infants over time and look at what's happening around these arousal peaks that we talked about. So what's happening when their heart rate is really high. So we know that in general populations, when there's a high arousal going on, when infants are distressed, there's a lot of negative affect vocalizations. So cries, for example, are an example of a negative affect vocalization. But some research from the lab shows that in some populations, there isn't always a negative vocalization at a high arousal. So this is just for an example, really. This is a paper that we did that looked at the difference between high chaos and low chaos households. And what we found here in low chaos households, so this is just kind of the general population equivalent, is that where there is high arousal, so the dark blue is high arousal, so distress, there are more negative vocalizations as would be expected. But in high chaos households, that relationship isn't seen. So high chaos is characterized by, I think, like things like the TV going on all the time, lots of activity, lots of busyness, like lots of kids being always late, this kind of thing. And in these households, this kind of relationship between this high distress and negative affect vocalizations just isn't there. So this is just an example within these two populations, but it does kind of show that if we dig deeper within general populations, are there going to be different groups of infants that have different ways of using their behavior to communicate their distress, maybe under communicate or maybe over communicate? And that's really the basis of my research. So this is the important question, really, is what can caregivers do to decrease infant distress? So in the same way that distress can be both physiologically and behaviorally communicated, so communicated with the body and with the behavior, caregivers can respond both physiologically with their heart rate and with their behavior as well. We're used to thinking about caregiver responsiveness in terms of behavior, but what is actually going on kind of internally around those times? So yes, a lot of the literature talks about sensitive caregiving and caregiving being really, really prompts, like the quicker the better, basically. But recent research has found that it can be too much. And if you think about this with anxious parents can be on their kids too much. And what this research by the lab, Sam and Celia at the lab found, was that anxious mums respond to everything that their kids do, not just the times when their kids are experiencing an arousal spike or experiencing distress. They're there all the time. And what that means is their kids don't, if they just have a minor upset, they don't learn to regulate their own emotion, and they don't learn to calm down by themselves. There can be too much of this kind of caregiver response. So again, in terms of responsive caregiving, we're again looking for this optimal mid-range of timing, and we're also looking at, from attachment literature, how important is consistency. We know in attachment literature that an inconsistent caregiver is associated with an insecure, resistant, anxious attachment. So how important is this consistent response in terms of timing and in terms of the type of response as well? So you can see here this is just like a really one example of physiological responsivity. So what is going on in the heart of the mum around what's going on in the heart rate of the infant. So you can see here, this infant is having their heart rate go above like 95% of what is normal here. So this is like their heart rate is up high. It's like 5%. It happens 5% of the rest of the time. And this is the associated adult at exactly the same time. So this is between 1234 and 1241, so over quite a short time scale. And you can see here that the infant's heart rate also goes up around, the adult's heart rate also goes up around the time of the infant's heart rate going up, and then together they come back down afterwards. So that's really the kind of relationship that we're looking for, that doesn't happen all of the time. And then we can also look at what's happening behaviorally with the caregiver response. So we can look at, like I said, the caregiver going over to the infant and picking them up and giving them a cuddle. But that's not the only thing that caregivers do. Before they do that, they might do other things. So the baby at the other end of the room might vocalize, and it might be getting a bit more distressed, not quite at its peak yet and not quite crying, but quite fussy. And so one of the things that caregivers can do is just vocalize in response to their infants and speak to them and try to soothe them with their voice. So this is just a schematic of that happening: the infant speaking, the adult vocalizing, the infant vocalizing, and this kind of turn taking between them. So it's kind of really interesting to look at these kind of patterns of vocalizations around infant distress and how caregivers use them to calm their infants before they do other things like approach them and carry. And other modalities they could use are facial effects, so kind of calm, compassionate faces, looking at their infant, touching them, like sensitive touch, approaching them, carrying them, and feeding them, of course. So what we're going to look for is what makes an appropriate behavioural response from the caregiver. So really these distinctions come from attachment literature, but what we're really looking for is for what we would term secure infants, what is an appropriate and consistent response? What does that look like? For the anxious infants, what does an appropriate and inconsistent caregiver response look like? What is an overly responsive mum doing? What is an under responsive mum or caregiver doing? When is a response insensitive and when is it frightening? And finally, what happens when this co-regulatory response goes wrong? So we can see here, we talked a bit about anxious mums already. So the red line here is mums that have high anxiety. The blue line is mums that have low anxiety. And this is when the infant is making a noise that's negative, so a cry or just a general kind of grumble, then happy. This is when the infant is making a positive vocalization, so a laugh or just something else that's positive, and this is when it's neutral. And you can see here that the parental anxiety has differences in how the infant's heart rate changes after their vocalization. So anxious mums have infants whose heart rates are higher after a negative vocalization, and non-anxious mums have infants whose heart rate is lower. So that suggests that there is something about the responding time of mums with anxiety that has an effect on how infants recover physiologically after making a vocalization. And we can see the same distinction here with positive vocalizations. Those with high anxiety, the infants have a higher rate during the recovery period than those with low anxiety. Now, this is important because, as I talked about at the beginning of the talk, there's a link between child behaviours and what we call internalizing and externalizing problems later in life. So later in life can be in later childhood, in adolescence, and in adulthood. So internalizing are the problems that we typically think about in relation to like anxiety, withdrawal, this kind of withdrawing and dysphoria. And externalizing are the opposite of that. So acting out on the environment, so aggression, ADHD, are all examples of externalizing disorders. And we know that these disorders are predicted by the relationship between the caregiver and the child. They're predicted by actually the the co-regulation and regulation that's happening in this early relationship. So the better caregivers co-regulate their infants, the better infants grow up into children and adults that are able to regulate their own emotions. And when that important first co-regulatory process does not go well, that is when you get children who do not develop this ability to regulate their emotions and grow up with, you know, many of the what we call mental health disorders today, like anxiety and so on, are just come from this lack of ability to be able to regulate what's going on behaviorally and what's going on physiologically around these extremes of emotions, which we all have. So it's not about stopping us from having the intense emotion. It's about what we are doing and how we learn to do with our body and with our behavior around these stressful or dysregulatory events. So what's going to be really interesting in my research is to look at how children change their behavior in relation to caregiver responsiveness over time. So how do we measure this and what are we going to see? So I don't know because I haven't finished my research project yet, but my prediction is that over time, for those infants that we classify secure with the strained situation in attachment, there's going to be a relationship between infant autonomic arousal, so what's going on physiologically in the body with their heart and so on, and their behaviour. But for those infants that are less securely attached, there's going to be like a different relationship than the one we would expect between their arousal level, so what they're feeling, and what their behavior is showing. So what I predict will happen is some children will over communicate their small scale fluctuations. So rather than just communicating and making a fuss when they have a 95% percentile peak of emotion, they'll be making a fuss when they have just a, I don't know, 70% arousal fluctuation, or they'll under communicate their large scale crisis. So even when they feel massively dysregulated, the same with avoidant infants in the strained situation, you won't be able to tell so much. And that pattern, I predict, will get stronger over time. So at the beginning, you'll have all the infants and their behavior will be matching what they're feeling. And over time, you will get these differences in the secure ones, kind of like matching more with what they're experiencing, and some children over communicating and some children under communicating. And then this slide is just there because there's a lot of really good resources out there about adults who haven't learnt this ability to regulate their emotion. And this doesn't mean that, you know, there's bad parents or good parents, or adults that are doing great or adults that are not doing great. It just means that for some people, we learnt this skill when we were infants from our parents, who learnt it from their parents, who learnt it from their parents. And some of us, we didn't learn this skill when we were infants because our parents didn't teach it to us, because they didn't learn it from their caregivers and they didn't learn it from their caregivers. So these two resources, which you can find on Instagram or elsewhere, if you just have a Google, do a lot of work around this. The holistic psychologist is for adults, and Dr. Becky Inside is for parents. So how to, in the moment, parent your children so they develop better regulatory strategies.